Beep, 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 beep.
We had a pretty large bang associated with the caution and warning now. Okay, as we have an apparent serious oxygen leak.
4, 3, 2, 1.
Houston, we've had a problem. He's in a roll and he can't stop it. Performing an evasive maneuver. Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here. I think we need to do a little more all-weather testing. Welcome to space.
Hello and welcome to Failure to Launch, the space history podcast where we take you through all the mistakes, failures, and explosions that made modern space exploration possible. We are, as always, your hosts, Quinn,
Chris.
And maybe Chris?
This is going to be episode 3 of our series on Sputnik 1, where we'll be talking all about the launch of the world's first satellite and how the world reacted, and the horrible history and politics that went into it.
Here we are, 5 months later, we're returning to Korolev.
Exactly.
The scene of the crime.
Our
9 months later, we're coming back to Korolev. We're checking up on him in the gulag.
We do
How
not
is the
need to tell the
research
listeners
coming?
that. As far as they knew, we recorded part 2 last week.
Oh, we did.
Shut up.
Yes.
But we're coming back thematically to Korolev 9 months after his initial inception. And
A finder
especially-
he's been in the
Soviet.
gulag this whole time.
So yeah, where we last left off, Nikita Khrushchev had just barely survived a coup, and Sergei Korolev had just gotten the green light to launch an unfinished rocket with a crappy satellite he cobbled together. To do this, he'd made enemies of his superiors in the Red Army who wanted a functional missile, as well as all of the scientists who wanted to launch a satellite that could, actually do science. But none of these men had what Korolev had: the pathological need to beat the Americans to orbit and the unconditional support of a dictator. Korolev's rivals were forced to back down and accept his proposal to launch a simple satellite, what would come to be known as Sputnik 1.
The perfect propaganda satellite.
Before we get into the actual launch, I want to take a bit of time to talk about Sputnik itself. So, we all know what Sputnik looks like, right? We've all seen the pictures.
Is the ball, and he's got some little antennas on him that probably don't even do anything. And
It's a chrome beach ball. It's the basketball with whiskers.
But he's not just the ball, he's the orb.
Yeah, and one of the big points with Sputnik, I think, is that a lot of people assume that since it was the first satellite, they assume it had to be crewed, or that it was the best that the Soviets could do at the time. And I think that's absolutely not true. Remember that the scientists working for Korolev, they had a satellite about the size of a van that was just covered in scientific instruments, and that was the satellite called Object D. This satellite, Object D, was Sputnik's rival, and it was the perfect scientific satellite. Loads of instruments. If they launched that, it would catapult the Soviet Union into a new era of scientific discovery and all that. Whenever you compare it to a 180-pound beach ball that couldn't do anything but beep, and you can understand why the scientists hated Korolev's plan, but that doesn't mean Sputnik was poorly designed, just that it was very well designed for a totally different mission. See,
I'm thinking about it now. Sorry to run you off the rails here, but it's the you versus the guy your girlfriend tells you not to worry about or whatever.
except it's odd. The guy is looking at Sputnik. It's Korolev. He's looking at Sputnik, and the girl he's looking away from is 2 tons of incredibly expensive scientific instruments, and what he's looking at is beep, beep, beep. The whole thing for him is just Object D is going to take time. The Americans are going to launch tomorrow. We need to get a satellite out right the fuck now.
So hear me out. The ball that screams.
So, like we said, it was very well designed, just not for a scientific mission. See, Korolev knew that Sputnik would be a PR move first and a scientific breakthrough second. So, yeah, he set out to design just the ultimate propaganda satellite. And that idea went into pretty much every design element of Sputnik. The satellite's payload of batteries and transmitters were set to civilian frequencies, so amateur radio listeners could listen in. He chose a spherical shape and a polished chrome casing because Korolev knew that would catch the light best. He even had the R7 booster that carried Sputnik rigged with reflective panels and planned Sputnik's orbit so that it would appear over the US at night. Like, the R7 was already proven to work. They had done tests. They had put articles out in Pravda. That's not what Sputnik was for. Sputnik was to make sure that the entire world knew that the R7 worked. The message was simple: if it can carry a satellite, it can carry a bomb.
The launch.
So, Sputnik 1 launched from Tyuratam on October 4th, 1957. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because this show is about failures, and Sputnik's launch goes off without a hitch. There is a slight problem, though. One of the boosters cuts off early, so the satellite wound up in a shallower orbit than expected. Because of this, it would eventually burn up after 92 days in orbit. Now, this didn't really matter to the Soviets because it only had enough battery to transmit for 30 days. But that is not the most interesting thing about Sputnik, because as we've already established, it was a propaganda satellite. And for this episode, we are going to talk about the impact Sputnik had on the public and how the world's governments reacted to it. And what better place to start than with the Soviet Union and Khrushchev?
The Soviet reaction to Sputnik.
Very surprisingly, it was actually the Soviets that had the slowest reaction to Sputnik, Khrushchev especially. You'd think that they would be the most ready to capitalize on this, but the Kremlin didn't care. There were a few reasons for this, namely that Soviet leaders didn't appreciate the value that a satellite could have, but mostly because Khrushchev was sort of busy at the time. I'm going to ask you a question based on what we've talked about in the last 2 episodes on Sputnik. Can you guess what Khrushchev was up to on the day that Sputnik launched?
I mean, he has to be plotting to.
Was he on the receiving or giving end of the coup at this point?
Okay,
The coup.
you're good. Yes, you're there. He was almost okay. He was almost on the receiving end of a coup, if that makes sense. And he was purging his enemies to prevent that coup.
I'm feeling there's some air
mixing
quotes
things
around.
up. So
I'm feeling there's some air quotes around enemies with this one.
okay, we will get to that because this time the quote unquote threat to his power was one Georgy Zhukov, his defense minister. Yeah, this is the legendary badass Soviet general who took Berlin in World War II, accepted Germany's surrender, and crucially, he's the only reason Khrushchev is still in power.
He helped me. He could kill me.
Yes. Khrushchev watches Zhukov single-handedly prevent a coup and put him back in power, and he's so ungrateful that in his mind, the only thing he thinks is like, this guy can topple the government just like that. Like, he watches Zhukov just completely get rid of the entire top layer of the Soviet government. And Khrushchev also considered him a threat because of the massive hold he had over the Soviet military, not to mention his incredible popularity among the Soviet people. He was basically like Patton and Eisenhower all like rolled into one. He was all those famous Allied generals. The Soviets just had Zhukov. He was that. He was like a rock star.
Back in the days when it was still, what did you do? I was in the war.
Yeah, like what did I do in the war? I took Berlin. If you watch, have you guys ever seen the movie The Death of Stalin?
No, it's on my list though.
It is a very good movie, and yeah, the Zhukov character really comes into it there. To give you an idea, it's obviously not perfect and completely historical, but like it gets him pretty good. Good enough that it got banned in Russia.
Wait, really?
Yeah. Zhukov's daughter was like, this is defaming him, even though like he's probably the coolest character in the movie. Anyway, yeah, so he's very popular with the Soviet people, and like Khrushchev wonders whether the Soviet army is loyal more to Zhukov than to the government, kind of thing. And remember, this is also at the same time that Khrushchev was slashing the Red Army to pay for all of his social programs, something that did not endear him to army leadership. To give you an idea just how big those cuts were, I'm going to quote from Red Moon Rising. Quote, Since starting work on the ICBM, Khrushchev had unilaterally slashed troop forces by a staggering 2 million men. He had canceled long-range bomber orders and converted aircraft factories to building passenger planes. Military airfields had been turned over to civilian use under the expectation that rockets would soon arrive to protect the Soviet Union. Entire artillery divisions had been similarly scrapped, while dumbfounded admirals had helplessly watched brand new battle cruisers, shark fodder, as Khrushchev derisively called them, get cut up into scrap steel before ever having a chance to leave their naval shipyards. Following the R-7's August success, Khrushchev had announced a further round of 300,000 troop reductions for the end of the year. Only submarines, which would carry the unproven missiles on which he was basing his entire defense doctrines, saw an increase in orders. Like, we talked in the last episode how he slashes the Red Army's funding by a third. Like, he takes their troops and fires 2 million of them. We talk about him kind of like Korolev kind of selling him on this idea. I need to make it clear how sold Khrushchev is. He is taking the most powerful military in the world and he is just cutting it up because he thinks, rockets. All we need is rockets. So understandably, a lot of the Soviet brass did not like Khrushchev. But this uneasy peace continued for a while, with Khrushchev being unable to depose someone as powerful as Zhukov. The final straw, though, came when Khrushchev discovered new saboteur schools being built just outside Moscow. So on paper, these schools, they were set up to train Soviet advisors who would go help communist guerrilla movements around the world. But there was a wrinkle. Normally, when the Red Army made a new unit, they would notify the Kremlin, something Zhukov failed to do here.
No.
Yes, because on the one hand, we have a paranoid, narcissistic leader who's
Russian
already
dictator.
looking for threats. Yes, and he looks from, this is in Moscow. He looks out the window of the Kremlin and he can see Zhukov setting up schools for training dudes specifically how to overthrow governments and not telling the Kremlin about this.
Oh, yeah, so the paranoia has been cranked.
It has been maybe validated. We don't know. We have no way of knowing whether Zhukov actually intended to pull a coup or if the army just forgot to notify the Kremlin of these new schools. Either way, Khrushchev decided to act. On October 4th, the same day Sputnik launched, Zhukov was sent off on an emergency diplomatic trip to Yugoslavia, during which time Khrushchev would try and rally support to oust his defense minister. Whenever he comes back from this trip, he immediately gets dragged into a meeting with the Presidium, and they just, all of those guys there just start shouting accusations at him. Zhukov was accused of non-party behavior, adventurous foreign policy, and of building his own cult of personality. Maybe that last one was a little true. At any rate, he was forced to retire.
You don't have to build what people make for you.
And Sputnik actually comes at a great time for Khrushchev because the news of Sputnik is partially used to cover up Zhukov being gotten rid of. But
that's actually smart.
That doesn't happen for a little bit because on the day that Sputnik launched, Khrushchev was reportedly not too interested. His memoirs called it just another Korolev launch. The R-7 had already had 2 successful test launches, so this new one wasn't too important. He recognized Sputnik as a way to prove how capable the R-7 was, but not for any kind of scientific or propaganda breakthrough. And if the boss wasn't interested, then it, wasn't worth talking about. On October 5th, the day after Sputnik launched, the front page of Pravda read, "Preparations for winter," and listed grain stockpiles for the coming, freeze. Sputnik was mentioned, but only in a short section. Quote, "On October 4th, 1957, this first satellite was successfully launched in the USSR. According to preliminary data, the carrier rocket has imparted to the satellite the required orbital velocity of about 8,000 meters per second. At the present time, the satellite is describing elliptical trajectories around the Earth, and its flight can be observed in the rays of the rising and setting sun with the aid of very simple optical instruments, binoculars, telescopes, etc." That's it. That is literally it. There's no cheering. There's no propaganda. This is buried deep in the this isn't front page either. This is deep in the newspaper. The front page is just hey, here's where you can find bread.
Here's how you can live. Behold
like,
the chrome ball. It is superior.
all they gave was just a quick technical brief about a thing that happened. That's it.
Like a kid's science fair.
Yeah. It's just like, yeah, we launched a satellite. Here is the orbital velocity it currently has. Like as far as the Kremlin was concerned, that was the end of it. Their new missile worked, and now no one could question that it worked because it had put a satellite in orbit. Even Korolev and his team didn't seem to register what Sputnik represented. They'd been working nonstop for months, and most were just happy to have a moment to relax, visit their families, and get the hell out of Tyuratam. Boris Chertok, one of the lead engineers on the R-7, said,
"It was late. We went to bed. We thought the satellite was just a simple device, and that the importance of the launch had been to test the R-7 again and gather data."
It would take the rest of the world to show them just how big a deal Sputnik really was.
The world's reaction to Sputnik.
I can't help but just, imagine this guy just said, well, we launched it, cool. And meanwhile, across the ocean, everyone's having a fucking melt.
Okay, that's actually what we're about to talk about.
These guys are just tired jobbers getting on the plane to go home, like, oh, and you pan zoom to the other side of the planet, smash cut to New York. It's like women screaming, clutching their faces. There's stuff falling out of the sky. Some dude crashes his car into a fire hydrant. Like papers flying everywhere, dogs barking, like cats screaming. Like
everybody's pointing at like the sky, screaming.
No, there you go. In memes, when we pan back to the Soviet Union, this is all we see.
Shut up, the boy.
To understand the US and the world reaction, I think it's important, like the same way we did with the Soviet Union, to talk about the historical context and the political situation going around at the time. So in order to understand Sputnik, it's important to understand what's going on in the US in late 1957. In the US, Sputnik didn't really rock the boat for the US government. They knew about the R-7, they'd had U-2 spy planes take pictures of the launch site several times, and they figured out its capabilities based on the size of this massive new rocket. When Sputnik launched, they initially viewed it the same way Khrushchev did, just another missile test, only this time with a neat little trick bolted on top. Nothing to worry about. This blasé attitude flavored the government's response to the launch. From Red Moon Rising, quote, "He, Eisenhower, never took more than a skeleton staff to intrude on his privacy in Gettysburg, and that is perhaps one reason why there is no record from any White House aides as to how the president reacted when told that night that the Soviet Union had launched a satellite. What is known, according to space historian Paul Dixon, is that the next morning the president of the United States played golf for the 5th time that week. In Eisenhower's absence, it was John Foster Dulles who drafted the official White House response to Sputnik. The launch was an event of considerable technical and scientific importance, Dulles allowed in an October 5th statement. However, that importance should not be exaggerated. What has happened involves no basic discovery, and the value of a satellite to mankind will for a long time be highly problematical. The Germans had made a major advance in the field, and the result of their efforts was largely taken over by the Soviets when they took the German assets, human and material." So, do you see what he's doing there?
It sounds like a little bit of a... You're not the only ones who paper clipped.
Those godless commies took in those godless Nazi scientists.
The ones we were trying to poach.
The official American response was to accuse the Soviets of copying American designs and using former Nazi scientists, while those exact scientists were working in Texas, not Kazakhstan. But that was the official tone of the US government, and as far as they were concerned, that was that. And that's likely how the American public also would have perceived Sputnik if it weren't for the media, who decided that Sputnik was actually a very big story for one simple reason: fear.
Oh, we all know how well that sells.
Yes. And the American government, they viewed it in kind of military terms, and they knew that their invincibility would not last, and that the Soviet Union would eventually develop some kind of weapon that could strike the US. The US had long targeted Soviet cities, and now Khrushchev was doing the same. That's how an arms race works. Fair's fair.
Yes.
They also rightly believed that the R-7 was a very immature weapons system years away from deployment, and the US still had a major advantage with their bomber fleet. The public, though, did not see it that way. They understood Khrushchev's message, that if a rocket could carry a satellite, it could carry a bomb. And for the first time in recent history, the mainland United States was in the direct line of fire. Like, that had not happened in any world war. The media picked up on this, and they fanned the flames to great effect. Sputnik was labeled a great national emergency, a technological Pearl Harbor. The sphere's chilling beeps, echoed Time, were a signal that in vital sectors of the technology race, the U.S. may well have lost its precious lead. It was a devastating blow to the prestige of the United States. As with most world events, Sputnik quickly became a political topic. Dwight D. Eisenhower was the president, and the Democrat opposition took Sputnik as proof that he was letting the Soviets take the technological lead. Of these politicians, none shouted quite as loud as Lyndon B. Johnson, then the Senate Majority Leader. He attacked Eisenhower's complacency and demanded a thorough investigation of America's own rocket programs, shouting,
"Soon they will be dropping bombs on us from space like kids dropping rocks on the cars from freeway overpasses."
Between the media and the politicians amping up this new Soviet satellite, the American public's view of Sputnik shifted quickly from ambivalent to terrified. Seeing the brewing problem, the White House decided that Eisenhower had to respond directly and try to calm Americans down. He spoke about how rockets were still new and untested, that America vastly outnumbered the Soviets in both bombers and bombs, and that America's own rocket programs would soon be launching their own satellites. While he was technically correct, his speech utterly failed to put the public at ease. Americans were scared and angry. They knew that they were under threat and that their Cold War rival had beaten them. The last thing they wanted to hear was the president downplaying Sputnik. Instead of instilling confidence, Eisenhower's speeches gave Americans the impression that he just didn't understand Sputnik. Eisenhower's speech was also meant to shore up support of America's allies, some of whom were looking at Sputnik and wondering if they'd maybe picked the wrong side. In Mexico, book editors started requesting Soviet scientific source material over American material. In Japan, the government started pushing back against U.S. plans to deploy more troops. Polls conducted in France and Britain showed that before Sputnik, only 6% of people thought that the Soviet Union was a military equal to the U.S. After Sputnik, more than half believed that America was the weaker superpower. Meanwhile, communist countries like China and North Korea were taking Sputnik as proof of the superiority of socialist science over the decadence of the West. It's also worth mentioning that Sputnik came at a pretty bad time for America. A month earlier, in Little Rock, Arkansas, riots had broken out over the Little Rock Nine. Have you guys ever heard of them?
No.
So this was a group of 9 black students.
Okay. I know what you're talking about now.
This becomes known as the Little Rock Crisis for a reason I'm going to get into here. So these 9 black students, they attempted to register for classes at the all-white Central High School. When the students arrived at the school, they were met by a mob that chased them off and nearly lynched one of the students. In response, Arkansas's governor, a man named Orville Faubus, called in the National Guard, but he called them in to support the mob and block the teens from registering. The stalemate continued for another 2 weeks when the Little Rock Nine were led into the school under police escort. An angry mob, again organized and encouraged by Faubus, immediately showed up and attacked the school. They smashed windows, they tried to start fires, and they demanded the black students be handed over to them. When the mayor of Little Rock called Eisenhower for help, the ex-general turned president was understandably pretty pissed at Faubus's little insurrection. He immediately federalized the Arkansas National Guard, taking them out of the governor's hands, and he deployed 1,000 paratroopers from the 101st Airborne to fully occupy and pacify Little Rock, enforce desegregation orders, and protect the students. By the time Sputnik launched in early October, the crisis had been resolved, but this was still this was bad optics for the United States. This was a human rights debacle that hurt their reputation on the world stage. For Eisenhower, the crisis damaged his image as a leader in control, with former Secretary of State Dean Acheson describing him as
a weak president who fiddled along ineffectually until a personal affront drives him to unexpectedly drastic action.
Obviously, nowadays, I think I can say, fuck that Faubus guy. Eisenhower deployed the 101st Airborne to
a group that is known for
occupy a racist town. Okay, in practice, they actually they deployed very few black members of the 101st. They deliberately left a lot of them out because they didn't want it to rile up the locals more than it had to.
They were there to mix shit up if they had to, not to.
But at the time, this is viewed as a bad thing. People look at this and they think they look at Eisenhower's response and they go oh, he's being awful angry about this. And all of this was this was used by the Soviets for propaganda to directly contrast their incredible scientific progress next to America having an insurrection over whether or not black kids can go to school. While initial news about Sputnik focused on the satellite itself, eventually the media around the world began focusing on the two superpowers. Communist states in particular declared Sputnik a moral victory for the Soviet Union, as well as a technological one. China's main daily hailed Sputnik as a
validation of the superiority of Marxist-Leninist technology,
while Radio Cairo declared that
the planetary era rings the death knell of colonialism. The American policy of encirclement of the Soviet Union has pitifully failed.
The New York Times called it
a turning point in civilization that could only be achieved by a country with a first-rate conditions in a vast area of science and engineering.
While France's Le Figaro commented on the
dissolution and bitter reflections of the Americans who have little experience with humiliation in the technical domain.
Finally, The Guardian wrote,
it demands a psychological adjustment on our part towards Soviet society, Soviet military capabilities, and perhaps, most of all, to the relationship of the world to what is beyond. The Russians can now build ballistic missiles capable of striking any chosen target anywhere in the world. Clearly, they have established a great lead in missile technology.
The Soviet Reaction, Part 2.
We haven't talked a lot about the actual, proper Soviet response. We talked about their very lackluster one, but they eventually figure it out. So, let's get back to the Soviet Union. While the world was in a panic over their new satellite, all this news didn't really reach Khrushchev until the night of October 5th, a full day after Sputnik launched. While Pravda was busy writing about grain shortages, the KGB collected newspaper clippings from all around the world and provided them to Khrushchev, who was amazed. Now, as we've talked about, Khrushchev is not a dude who lets a good opportunity go to waste. He saw that the winds had shifted for his country, that they were no longer regarded as a technologically backward pariah state, and so he directed the entire Soviet propaganda machine to focus on their new achievement, or more specifically, his new achievement. Khrushchev ordered poems written about Sputnik's incredible leap forward and published timetables in every major city showing exactly when Sputnik would pass overhead so, average citizens could go out and watch. Moscow was plastered in banners reading "First in Space," and factories started churning out these little metal pins for Soviets to wear. At the same time, photos of the racism in Little Rock were distributed to drive home the difference between Soviet innovation and American oppression.
I feel like you can draw an analog to today as well. I feel like that's still like a pro-Russian sentiment to have of oh well, we're not doing bad things right now. Look, think about how America used to be when they did the Trail of Tears, right? It's not any different. It's excusable.
Whataboutism is a prominent Russian tradition. Don't you dare step on it.
It is very prominently used by the Russians, especially these days. Let's be fair in that everybody uses it.
Our forward-thinking and sophisticated crony capitalistic gangsterism versus the barbarity of homosexual America.
The homosexual communist agenda.
The globo homo needs to be countered at all times.
Oh, God.
Now, all of this served two purposes. First, to pump up Khrushchev's own image and cement his place in Soviet history. Sputnik was his achievement, and he was solely responsible for making the Soviet Union into a superpower, at least according to the propaganda. To give you an idea of the egotism at play, I'm going to quote from Pravda. In his able proposals, there is evidence again and again of the great conviction in the triumph of Soviet rocket technology. He participates in the discussions of all the most vital experiments and directs the development of the major directions of technical progress in the country. Case in point, every single use of the word "he" in that quote is capitalized. Like they're talking about God or something.
Yeah, they're God, Gagarin.
Yeah. No, Khrushchev, what?
Oh,
at this point, Khrushchev. We're not quite at the Gagarin cult yet. So that was the first purpose. Pump up Khrushchev himself, make himself seem involved in all of this. Yes. The second was to instill some pride in the Soviet people. They were not ignorant of the world, and they knew how they were viewed. They knew that other countries had luxuries they didn't. But with Sputnik, they finally had something that no one else did. Ordinary Soviets who days earlier had neither heard of nor cared about satellites were suddenly space converts, overwhelmed with national pride and a newfound sense of security and superiority. So this is like...
wait a second.
Yeah, and this isn't. I don't necessarily view this one as a bad thing. You know, this is like
not saying it is at all.
Suddenly have something big to be proud of. You know, and not just our big military will roll over you kind of thing. Like this is the Soviets, their system that maybe it doesn't produce the best cars or the best luxury goods, has done something that no one else in the world has, and has like not just pushed science, like unquestionably pushed human progress as a species forward by a huge step. And propaganda starts running with this. So like Soviet people, it's like we saw with the Gagarin posters. A big theme is your sacrifice and your work, however small or insignificant it may feel, is going into the big Soviet project. And that big Soviet project just puts Sputnik in orbit. So here's a pin. So here's a pin. Wear it on your lapel right now.
The legacy of Sputnik 1.
And that's about where we can leave it, I think. Sputnik, the world's first satellite, was a comedy of errors. It was built by men who hated each other and got the job only by lying to a naive leader. That same leader used it as a tool to preserve his power and remove his rivals. The story involved 3 rebellions in Warsaw Pact countries and 2 coup attempts in the Soviet Union. The satellite had no scientific instruments, controls, or anything other than batteries and transmitters. The rocket it rode to orbit proved to be a failure as a missile, useful only for launching other spacecraft, something it still does today. The man who headed the project became a space legend, but ruined his marriage and his already fragile health. But Sputnik did something that a nuclear warhead couldn't. It terrified a superpower, it turned the Soviet Union into a superpower, and it kicked off the space race.
Everyone summarily shat their pants. And honestly, the craziest part about that is how outsized the response was. It might not seem outsized, just initially.
Do you mean from the world, or
specifically from the USA? Because as we were talking about, in the Soviet countries, it didn't really provoke too much. It was obviously a great achievement, but blinky ball go whoosh around the world. Meanwhile, across the fucking ocean, everyone was losing their damn mind.
We also need to point out that, like, at first, it didn't provoke a big response inside the Soviet Union. Like, once Khrushchev once they realize how big of a win that they have, once Khrushchev actually
once he weaponized it,
this is big. Like, there are pictures. It'll be on the video right now. Red Square has these huge, like, they put up a huge model of a globe, and they have all these, it's like fully like motorized. They have these Sputniks orbiting around it in a cloud. Everybody there, like we said in Moscow, everybody's wearing these pins. They put up these huge banners, like first in space, emblazoned across buildings. Like, it goes, and that's the day after Sputnik launches. Like, it goes from 0 to 100 very quickly in the Soviet Union. And from that point forward, Sputnik, it doesn't just feature heavily in propaganda. It becomes like a leitmotif, like a theme that shows up repeatedly, that is used synonymously with Soviet victory.
I know we've mentioned this before, but the fact that it passed into lexicon as a Sputnik moment.
Yeah. If you want to look at any sign of how big that was,
that sentence right there.
Can I roll this back to the celebration day? You said that was the day after the launch?
Yes. Yeah.
I love the idea that this entire program that up until this point is basically just convenient accidents of choice. And then the day of the victory is just like, oh yeah, like this thing that we didn't think was going to be such a big deal is this big a deal. Hey guys, get those painters out and paint on the buildings.
Yes.
It's like the ability of a dictatorship to make people do things.
Like Khrushchev and was just
to respond on a dime, to mass produce the needed, these little are they little Sputnik pins? You said, like, Yeah, the little Sputnik pins, and they're painting on the buildings, and they build this machinery. Just like, you know, it's like you have 8 hours to do this.
Like he just woke up in the middle of the night and just ordered.
Yeah,
build.
you have 8 hours to do this. We're doing this parade at 8 a.m.
Yeah, so that is the end of our 3-part series on Sputnik, on the whole story of it.
How it passed into history and lexicon.
Next time, though, I think we're going to be talking about Laika and the Soviet dog launches. Now, I do want to eventually break out of the kind of chronological order of things. This one, talking about Laika, though, I feel it's very important because it ties off, like, it follows directly from Sputnik. And we're going to go over why in the next episode of Failure to Launch.
Thank you for listening to Failure to Launch. If you enjoyed the show, please leave us a review or tell a friend. Everything helps. If you want to follow us, contact us, or suggest a topic, you can email us at launchfailurepodcast@gmail.com. We're also on Twitter at launch_failure. Failure to Launch is hosted on Anchor, and we post on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. We also post our episodes with visual aids on YouTube at Failure to Launch. All music was provided by DJ Danarchy.